And we're looking at the next sign in the book of John where Jesus heals a blind man. And the thing that this whole incident is meant to make us evaluate is the quality of our own sight. It's meant to make us evaluate the quality of our own sight. Because if we read the whole incident really, really carefully, Jesus talks about two different ways of seeing. There's physical sight, and he talks about that with the healing of the blind man. A man who couldn't see physically can then see physically. But then he talks about another kind of seeing as well, where he says at the end of the passage to the religious leaders of the day, "You're blind, you know, and you're so blind you don't even know that you're blind. That is how blind you are." And if that doesn't make any sense to anyone so far, if the whole idea of someone being so blind that they don't know they're blind doesn't make sense, let me explain that by means of one of the little joys in my life. I have a cat, and if anyone has been to my house, they will have met my cat. That's Bert up on the screen there. He is one of the most irritating animals you will ever encounter in your life. I've lost the cat people in the room. If you've ever been to our small group, he interferes with that every single week. He will move from knee to knee to knee. So Martin and Mark, bless them, every week they end up with Bert on their lap at some point. If you try chucking him out, he has been known to just sit outside the window and yowl constantly, or find an open window and dive through it. He is just irritating. He's noisy, he invades your personal space. I do love him, yeah. And one of his favourite things to invade is shopping. He loves it when we do the shopping. He loves to get in bags and to stick his nose in. He loves boxes, especially boxes that rattle. Boxes are his delight. They're second only to salad bowls, which of course must be sat in as soon as they got out of the cupboard. And if there's boxes in our shopping, he will look at them, he will fuss round them, he will yowl about them. He loves boxes. In fact, he even loves this box. It rattles. It makes all of the right noises. And when he sees this box and he hears it rattling, he thinks there's a little treat in there for him. Oh, there is a little treat in there for him, but not one that he likes. And one of my favorite things to do is to open up this box in his presence. He'll be yowling and he'll be all excited, and I'll be able to pull the vial out, and he's still looking at it and he's still excited until a specific moment. If you've ever used Frontline stuff as a pet owner, you know there's a very satisfying moment. You get the little vial out and you hold it and you just go snap with it. And it makes this delicious little click noise. And as soon as he hears that little snap, he knows. He sees that vial for what it truly is. He knows what happens when I've got one of them. And from that moment on, there's a battle of wills or battle of wits, really, where one of us is trying to catch the cat and put the stuff on his neck, and the cat is trying to run for his life. And sometimes I win, and sometimes he wins, but it's a great moment to see him scuttling out the cat flap and getting out of my space for a while. Whenever Bert hears the snap of the front line, he suddenly sees that thing for what it really is. It becomes real to him in a way that it had never been real before. He suddenly sees it for what it is. And this morning, I want you to imagine you are Bert the cat. And this passage that we're looking at is your front line. And you will need to be looking out for the snap of the little vial as we go along. Because I want you to see in this, this is not the best illustration I'm using here, but stick with it, okay? I want you to be thinking for the snap in what we look at as Jesus talks about the blind man and as we look at the whole incident. Because there is a way of seeing things which is beyond natural sight. We can see things in different ways. We can see injustice. We can see right and wrong. And in this passage, there's a way of seeing Jesus which we might never have seen before. The healing of the blind man gets us to think about how well we see, whether we can really see who Jesus is at all, whether we can see what he is about. And helpfully, there's three different groups of people in this story that we're going to look at. There is the blind man who goes from being physically blind to being able to see, but actually in the entire passage, he's the only one who sees Jesus clearly. We're going to be thinking about him. He can really, really see. You have the disciples who are half blind. They don't quite see everything that Jesus is about. And you have the Pharisees who are as blind can be to who Jesus is. It's not just a black and white binary picture we're given here. It's possible to follow Jesus and not see everything that he's about. And the disciples fall into that category. They follow him, but they don't grasp everything about him. And maybe some of us are like that today. We follow Jesus, but we don't see everything that he's about. If so, listen out for the snap of the front line for yourself. And if you hear it, you need to listen, and you need to not do what Bert does and run, but you need to come close to Jesus. So, keeping that front line image in your mind. I don't know why I decided that was a good idea, but I did. So, let's look at them to start with, the half-blind followers of Jesus. So we'll pick it up at the end of John chapter 8. So Jesus in that chapter has just had an altercation with the religious leaders of the day. He's clearly equated himself with God. So he said provocatively the words, "Before Abraham was born, I am." So he's clearly said that he predates Abraham and he's God, and the people want to stone him. And he slips away from them. And as he slips away from them with his disciples, there is a man that they come across who's probably by the side of the road, and he's probably begging. He's been blind from the moment he was born. And his disciples ask the question which reveals that they are half blind. They follow Jesus, but they don't know they don't know everything he's about. They're convinced he's from God, but they don't know what he's like. And so they ask this question, "Rabbi, this man's been blind from birth. So who sinned? Was it him or was it his parents?" That question is really revealing about the disciples' hearts, because it shows that when they look at someone like this man and they want to know why he's blind, they limit the scope of the possible causes for him. And they just want Jesus to clarify which one of the options that we've already decided is true. They're convinced that someone is to blame. He's either blind because his parents were so sinful in life that they were punished with a blind child, or he is so inherently sinful himself that he messed up his life before birth. Yep, they used to believe that you could sin in the womb, or they possibly thought maybe God looked at this person's life and they saw the person he was going to become, and they thought, you know what, he's going to be so bad, I'm going to make him blind from birth. They look at a man in tragic circumstances and believe, ultimately, it's down to someone close to him. It's either him or it's his parents. They think the circumstances that you go through are down to you. They can't see this man with compassion, and they can't see grace. They just see someone who's probably done something wrong. And I want us to just linger there for a moment, because we might need to ask ourselves, are we a bit like them? It might not be we look at blind people or disabled people and say they must have done something wrong, but is there something of their attitude in us? And if there is, you need to listen out for that little click of the front line. You need to listen out for it if you can't see or hear God's grace properly. Because if we're like them, we're not like Jesus. If we're like them, we're not like Jesus, and we need to change. So someone like the disciples were at this point in their lives, they will have a lack of compassion for people. You will look at maybe the homeless person on the street and you'll say, I wonder what they did to get into this situation. We might walk past people or see someone and decide they have brought all this on themselves. And if you have this mindset, if you think what people do, that's why they suffer, then what happens when you suffer? What if What if you lose your job? Or what if you get sick? Or what if you slip into mental illness? Or what if one of the tons of negative things that can happen in this world happen to you? If you're a half-blind follower of Jesus who believes that what you do determines how your life turns out, about other people you'll say they probably deserve it, and when things go wrong for you, you'll say, why are you doing this to me, God? Why am I being punished? What did I do to deserve this? And if you ever do that, you're like these disciples. You might not be exactly like them, but you've got something of what they're like in you. And the Bible gives us a much more nuanced and a much better answer to the question, why do people suffer? Why do bad things happen to them? So if you look at verse 3, it says, Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. So he rejects what the disciples say. He says it's nothing to do with this man or his family, which does leave us with the question, why is he blind? To which Jesus then says, but this happens so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? He's not born blind because of anything that he specifically did or his parents did. And it's not even that God wanted to show how cool Jesus is one day by making a person blind from birth. It's actually, this is a world that's broken, and Jesus is going to come into this man's life and he's going to fix it. He's going to fix it. The reason bad things happen, partly, is because we live in a world that's broken. We break it. Everyone is part of that. Everyone turns away from God, and the way it plays out is different for everyone. So you will have good people who suffer, and you will have terrible people who have great lives. But why is there suffering? Ultimately, it's because we've turned away from God and the world is broken. Which means it's not anyone's fault, necessarily. That's half the answer. But Jesus goes on to say, this happened so the works of God might be displayed in him. Jesus is saying in that moment, for his people, all things work for good. All things work for good. He's kind of in Romans 8 territory before Romans was ever written. All things work for good for those who love, for the good of those who love him. All things can be turned around for good in God's hands. So blindness can be turned around for good. Sickness, loneliness, depression, cancer, financial difficulty, they can all be turned around for good in God's hands. In a way, Jesus is saying this to his people. Look at people with the eyes of compassion. When you see someone who's got into a mess, when you look at the news and see gangs in Ipswich, we're supposed to say, this is part of being in a broken world, and there but for the grace of God go I. That's what we're supposed to say. We're supposed to be moved by compassion. If there's someone's life who's disintegrating, we need to be the people who step in and help. And the other side of the coin is this. When it's your own life that is going wrong, it's not because God's unjust, it's because he wants to work good out of the bad things that happen to you. If you were here the other week and heard Amanda's testimony, who heard that? Who thought that was really amazing? It was incredible. God has been at work in her life through her tumor. The tumor is not a good thing. If anyone thinks a tumor is a good thing, they're crazy. She's had a really tough few years, but God has used it for good in her life. She's got closer to God through it. She's become more assured of God through a tumor. That's how God works. He uses negative things for his glory. And so if you look at people without compassion, or you look at your own life and you sink into despair, you need to hear the click of the front line, and you need to take on board what Jesus says. All things work for good for those who love him. So that's the half-blind disciples. We then come to the fully blind people in the incident, the Pharisees. And what we're going to see about them is they are so blind to who Jesus is. They're like that black picture on the screen. They're so blind, they don't know that they're blind. That's probably the worst kind of blindness you can have, to not know that you are blind. And the scary thing, the really scary thing is, The reason for their blindness is exactly the same as the one for the disciples' half-blindness. So if you look at verse 34, when they eventually reject the blind man and they chuck him out, they say, "You were steeped in sin at birth." You were steeped in sin at birth. They say, "You deserved it." Exactly the same thing as the disciples. They can't hear what Jesus has said all the way through this passage because they're convinced that you get what you deserve. And they look at their own lives and they say, "I am okay. I am doing well." To which Jesus says to them, people who think they see will become blind. He tells them that they're blind. What Jesus is saying to them is, and we have to trace this through the passage, that they just can't see who Jesus is. So they want to investigate this healing. So if you look at verse 13, it tells us to start with, they brought the Pharisees to the man who'd been born blind. They brought to the Pharisees the man who'd been born blind, and they discover that Jesus, in healing this person, made mud on a Sabbath, and they conclude that that was work, therefore he can't be from God. They decide, no matter what he's done, he did that, so he can't be from God. They want to continue their investigation, so they ask the man's parents if he really was blind. The parents say yes, but we don't know how he got healed. You'll have to ask him that. They do that because these guys have already decided in advance, if anyone says Jesus is Messiah, we kick them out of the synagogue, which is kicking them out of society. By verse 24, they can't even bring themselves to name Jesus. They just simply say, "We know this man is a sinner." And by verse 29, we don't even know where he comes from. Don't even know where this guy comes from. They are blind. Something miraculous has happened, and they just want to ignore it. They want to explain it away. And the great thing is, the man who has been healed, he delivers the line to them which should have opened their eyes. So in verse 30, the blind man says to these religious experts who say they don't know where Jesus comes from, he says, "Now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." He goes at them with the logic of their faith, which should have caused them to stop and say, "You know what, this guy's got a point. We should check out who Jesus is." And yet their response was, "You deserved everything that happened to you." And they chuck him out. For them, God doesn't work like that. God doesn't work like that. They thought they were doing okay. They thought they didn't know Jesus. The problem these guys have, the reason they are so blind that they don't see that they're blind, and this is the really scary thing, they've had all the advantages in life. If you have all the advantages in life, it can make you blind to Jesus. And that's what's happened to these guys. They're proud, they're self-reliant, they have no compassion for the blind man. They had had every advantage in life, financial, education, religious, and it made them blind to who Jesus was. If you've been to church all of your life, that should make you sit up and take notice. You can have all the advantages and miss who Jesus is. They were blind to their sin. They were blind to grace. They were blind to Jesus. And the worst thing was, they couldn't even see it. And that's a scary place to be. And if either of those two positions, the half-blind disciples or the fully blind Pharisees, unnerves you and makes you uncomfortable, that's actually quite a good sign. It means that God's working in you to some extent, and you've heard a little bit of the click. You've heard a little bit of it. And so if you've thought, I might be a bit half-blind, I want to improve my sight, we want to see Jesus better, what we have to do is we have to look at the one guy in the story who really gets who Jesus is. And that's the one who was born blind to start with. And what I want you to do is to track his progression, because his sight gets better all the way through it. I mean, his physical sight was fixed straight away. His spiritual sight just gets better and better. So, chapter 9, verse 11. After his healing, he's asked, who did this to you? Who fixed your eyes? And his answer is, the man they call Jesus. So a man called Jesus fixed my eyes. By verse 17, he's had a bit more time to think. And so they ask him, what do you say about the guy who opened your eyes? And he says, he's a prophet. So it's gone from a man named Jesus to someone who's a prophet. By verse 33, he says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. So this is definitely someone from God for him. And then verse 38, he worshipped him. He worshipped Jesus. That is some progression. He's gone from just thinking it's a man called Jesus to being the God you worship. Possibly in a day, that's how much his sight has improved. And for a Jewish man to conclude that he should worship a human being, that is an incredible change in his life. That is unfathomable for them. That's how good his sight is. He sees just who Jesus is. So if you've thought this morning, I need to improve my sight of Jesus, what do? If you recognize you've got a lack of compassion in your life, if you're not as aware of your own sin as you should be, if grace doesn't just astound you every time you think about it, if you even daydream about someone who hurt you getting what they deserve, what do? What do? Well, you do what verse 38 says. You worship. You worship. Now, that doesn't mean you summon up all your willpower and sing really loudly in the last song. Doesn't mean that, although you might do that. It doesn't mean that you commit to doing a quiet time every day and praying, though you might well do that as well. If you want to really see who Jesus is, if you've heard that kind of unsettling click, you need to go to your spiritual Specsavers and get your sight fixed. And I want to show you the eye chart that fixes your spiritual sight. It's the cross. It is always the cross. The thing that will inspire you to worship is always Jesus and what he's done for you. It's always. So let's think about what an eye chart, a spiritual eye chart would say to us. What would we need to read? Well, we need to read things like this, that at the cross, Jesus, who's God's own Son, who's perfectly pure, who's gracious and compassionate, who deserves only honor and blessing from his Father, gives himself up for you. Gives himself up for you. He knows all of the sin that you've committed and everyone has committed, which causes this world to not work properly. He knows it's going to fall on him. He knows that for every moment where you have mistreated someone else or ignored God, all of God's anger at that is going to fall on him. He knows it. And it's kind of poised like a tsunami which is going to sweep over him. He knows it's going to happen, and he looks at it, and he looks at us through time, and he says, let that fall on me. Let that fall on me. You sung earlier today about every bitter thought, every evil deed crowning his blood-stained brow. He did that for you, all of yours. And so at the cross, it goes dark, it goes black, it goes so that it's difficult to see because Jesus can't find his Father's presence. He can't see his Father at that moment. Once he's done it, once he's died, the sun comes out. If you trust Jesus, the cross is your eye chart. It fixes your sight. It says to you, you deserve curse, you receive blessing. It says you deserve to be thrown out, you can be welcomed in. It says to you, you deserve death in all of its horribleness, you can have life. It says that when you do eventually die, there's a party waiting for you and it's started in advance. That's what it says. That's not a bad thought. So when you look at what Jesus has done, you should worship. When we sing Amazing Grace as we're going to in a few minutes, or less than a minute probably, your heart will be moved. You'll look at people with compassion. So if you've heard the click today that's made you as scared as my cat is when the front line is opened, look at the cross and keep looking there until you worship Jesus, because that will change everything. Let's pray. Father God, thank you. There are many of us in this room who could say the words, I was blind, but now I see, because we've recognized who Jesus is. And we ask that we will continue to see him, and see him clearly, and see him in all of his wonder. We ask that nothing would ever get in the way of that. And it could as well be this morning, Lord, that some of us, we don't see who Jesus is, but we kind of want to. If that's us, we ask as well that you might open our eyes so that we see him. And we want to have his compassion and his love and his mercy. Let us never look at someone, whoever they might be, and say that is all their fault, they brought it on themselves. Instead, fill us with the compassion of Jesus, who would look at a blind man and would say, I can change his life. Who would look at a woman caught in adultery and would say, she can be one of my people. Who would look at sinners and tax collectors and all kinds of people who'd made a mess in many ways and would say, it doesn't have to end that way. May we have his heart and his compassion. And help us to get that, not by trying to summon it up from ourselves, but looking at him. And we